Savannah Carter tightened her grip on Landon's tiny hand as they hurried down the cracked sidewalk, the chill of early autumn biting at her exposed skin. Her coat was too thin for the weather, but buying a new one wasn't an option. Not when the electricity bill was overdue, not when the rent was 2 weeks behind, not when she had just $11.47 left in her bank account. "Mommy, my feet hurt," Landon whined, tugging at her arm. She glanced down at her 5-year-old son, his little face flushed from the cold, his 2 big sneakers scuffing against the pavement. "Hand-me-downs from a charity bin." She forced a smile, even as the weight of everything threatened to break her in half. "We're almost there, baby," she lied, though the bus stop was still 4 blocks away. A gust of wind carried the scent of coffee and fresh pastries from the cafe across the street. Her stomach clenched painfully. She hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon, saving the last slice of bread for Landon's breakfast. But he had barely taken a few bites before pushing it away, saying it was stale. She'd laughed it off, ruffled his dark curls, told him they'd have a feast tonight. Another lie. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and her pulse spiked. She didn't have to look to know who it was. The calls never stopped, creditors, landlords, collectors with voices too cheerful for the kind of news they carried. She ignored it. "Mommy?" Landon's voice wavered. She followed his gaze to the man standing outside their apartment building. "Mr. Langley." Their landlord. Panic surged, but she masked it with a smile. "Hey, buddy, why don't we take the long way?" "But that's longer," Landon said, blinking up at her with innocent confusion. She couldn't argue with that. Before she could decide whether to bolt or bluff her way past Langley, he spotted her. "Miss Carter." "Damn." Langley was a small man with thinning hair, his belly pressing against the buttons of his cheap suit. He wasn't cruel, but he was a businessman first. And business didn't allow for sympathy. "Just the woman I was looking for," he said, stepping closer. His gaze flickered to Landon, then back to her, his expression softening slightly. "You know why I'm here." Savannah straightened, summoning whatever dignity she had left. "I just need a little more time." "You're already overdue. If you can't pay by Friday." "I will," she said quickly, the words tasting like acid. Langley sighed. "Savannah, I like you, and I don't want to evict you. But I can't keep covering for you." "I know," she whispered, shame burning her throat. Langley hesitated before lowering his voice. "There's a shelter on 5th. They help women in." "I don't need a shelter," she snapped, then immediately softened her tone. "I appreciate it, but I have a plan." He studied her, doubt clear in his eyes. "Friday," he said at last. "No later." She nodded, gripping Landon's hand tighter as she hurried away. A plan. That was another lie. By the time she reached the job interview, Savannah felt like she'd already lost. The towering glass building in the heart of Manhattan screamed money, the kind she'd never have, the kind that separated people like her from people like Dominic Sterling, the billionaire CEO she was about to interview with. Her stomach twisted. She'd only applied because the salary was triple what she made waitressing. It had seemed impossible that she'd even get a call back. Yet here she was, standing in the lobby of Sterling Enterprises, feeling like an imposter in her second-hand blazer and scuffed boots. She took a steadying breath and approached the receptionist, a sleek woman with sharp cheekbones and an even sharper stare. "Savannah Hayes," she said, trying to sound confident. "I have an interview at." The receptionist barely glanced up. 10th floor. Last door on the left." Savannah whispered a quick thanks and hurried to the elevator, her nerves crackling with every ding of the floor's passing. She needed this job. For Landon. For the roof over their heads. For a life that wasn't dictated by overdue notices and fear. When she reached the office, she knocked once before pushing the door open. And froze. Behind a massive oak desk sat a man she hadn't seen in nearly 7 years. Dominic Sterling. Her heart slammed into her ribs. He looked different, sharper, harder, every inch of him molded into power. He had always been striking, but now? Now he looked like a king surveying his empire, dressed in a tailored black suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, his jaw set like granite. And his eyes, deep, intense, stormy gray, locked onto hers with a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Recognition. Shock? Something darker. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them crackled, heavy with unspoken things, with memories neither had touched in years. Savannah swallowed hard, forcing her voice to work. I'm here for the assistant position, she said, hating how small she sounded. Dominic stood, slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving hers. I know who you are. The words sent ice down her spine. 7 years. 7 years since the last time she'd seen him. Since the night that had nearly changed everything. Since the moment she had walked away. And now, here he was. Not just a ghost from her past but the man who held her future in his hands. She forced herself to breathe. Then you know I need this job. Dominic didn't move, but something flickered in his gaze, calculation, curiosity, maybe even something dangerously close to possession. Savannah's pulse stuttered. This wasn't just a job interview anymore. It was a collision of past and present, a reminder of choices made and consequences waiting to unfold. She straightened her shoulders. No matter what lay ahead, she couldn't afford to walk away. Not this time. Not when everything depended on it. The silence in Dominic Sterling's office was thick, stretched taut like a wire about to snap. Savannah felt it pressing against her ribs, making it hard to breathe. He was staring at her, not like an old friend or a forgotten acquaintance, but like a man who had just found something he never thought he'd see again. Something he wasn't sure he wanted to let go of. Savannah forced herself to stand straighter, to ignore the way her knees wobbled beneath the weight of his gaze. 7 years had passed, but right now, it felt like no time at all. She swallowed hard. You're the CEO? Dominic's lips curled, just slightly. I am. Of course, he was. He had always been destined for greatness, ruthless intelligence wrapped in tailored suits and quiet dominance. But the boy she had once known, the one she had spent stolen nights whispering secrets to, was gone. This man was different. Sharper. Colder. And yet, there was something in his eyes that unsettled her, something that made her feel like she was standing too close to an open flame. I didn't realize this job was with you. Her voice came out thinner than she wanted. Would it have mattered? She hesitated. Yes. Dominic leaned back against his desk, arms folding across his chest. The movement was effortless, controlled, but she caught the slight tension in his jaw. You applied, he said, tilting his head. That means you need the job. Savannah clenched her hands at her sides. Of course, he'd get straight to the point. He had always been like that, direct, unflinching. But back then, it had been paired with warmth, with the boyish charm of someone who hadn't yet learned how to wield power like a weapon. Now, he was a man who didn't ask for things. He took them. She lifted her chin. I do. Something dark flickered across his face. How bad is it? Her stomach clenched. What? The situation. His eyes moved over her, slow and assessing, and suddenly she was painfully aware of her scuffed boots, of the coat she'd outgrown 2 winters ago. Of how obvious her desperation must be to someone like him. Savannah's throat tightened. She hated that he could see through her so easily. I don't need charity, Dominic, she said, sharper than she intended. His lips pressed together, and she braced herself for him to push, to demand answers. But instead, he exhaled slowly, drumming his fingers against the desk. So, you're here for the job, he said, voice unreadable. Yes. You'll take orders from me? Her stomach twisted. The way he said it, low, almost like a challenge, sent something sharp through her chest. She wasn't sure what unsettled her more, the idea of being at his mercy, or the fact that some reckless, buried part of her wasn't entirely opposed to it. I'll do my job, she said evenly. Dominic studied her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he pushed off the desk and strode toward her. She didn't move. Didn't breathe. He stopped just a foot away, his presence overwhelming, his scent, something expensive and faintly familiar, curling around her like smoke. I need someone I can trust, Savannah. His voice was quieter now, but there was an edge to it, something raw beneath the control. Can I trust you? She swallowed. Did he mean as an employee? Or something more? She pushed the thought away. I need this job, she said instead, because it was the only truth she could offer. Dominic's gaze lingered on her face, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once. You start tomorrow. Savannah barely remembered leaving the building. She was still numb by the time she reached the bus stop, Landon's small hand in hers. The entire day had felt like a fever dream, a cruel joke played by fate. Dominic Sterling. Of all the people in the world, Why did it have to be him? She looked down at Landon, his dark curls bouncing as he hummed a song to himself. He had no idea how close everything had come to falling apart today. How the only thing keeping them from sleeping on the streets was a man who had once meant something to her, something she hadn't dared to acknowledge in years. Was this a mistake? Would working for Dominic unravel everything she had spent so long burying? The thought made her chest ache, but she shoved it aside. This wasn't about her. It was about Landon. She could survive this. She had to. The next morning, Savannah stood in front of the Sterling Enterprises building, nerves twisting in her stomach like tangled wires. She was used to feeling out of place, but today, it was worse. The other women walking into the building were polished, their heels clicking against the marble floors with the kind of confidence Savannah couldn't afford. She exhaled and forced her feet forward. The receptionist barely glanced at her before directing her to the executive floor. She stepped into the elevator, gripping the strap of her thrift store purse as the doors slid shut. The ride-up felt endless. When the doors finally opened, she stepped into a space so sleek and modern it almost didn't seem real. And then she saw him. Dominic was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her, the city stretching out behind him in a sea of glass and steel. For a moment, she just watched him, the way he stood, strong, unshaken. He had built this. Had become this. A man who could command an empire with nothing but a glance. He turned before she could look away. Their eyes met. Something flickered in his expression, there and gone too fast for her to name. Savannah. His voice was smooth, but she caught the slight roughness beneath it, as if her name tasted different on his tongue after all these years. She swallowed. Mr. Sterling. His lips twitched. We're doing that, are we? She lifted her chin. You're my boss now. A beat of silence. Then he stepped closer. Not enough to touch, but enough that she felt him, his presence, his warmth, the sheer weight of him. I was always something to you, Savannah, he murmured. You just never wanted to admit it. Her breath hitched. But before she could respond, before she could even think, he turned away. Follow me, he said, already heading toward his office. Savannah exhaled slowly. This was going to be harder than she thought. And much, much more dangerous. Savannah had always believed that desperation had a taste. It was bitter, like burnt coffee and regret, like the coppery tang of fear that lingered on the back of her tongue every time she opened another past due notice. She could feel it now, sitting in the hollow of her chest as she stood in Dominic Sterling's office, her fingers curled tightly around the strap of her purse, nails digging into the worn fabric. He was watching her. He had barely said a word since she arrived that morning, but she could feel his eyes on her, studying, measuring. Dominic had always been observant, but this was different. This was a man piecing together a puzzle, and she had a sinking feeling she was the missing piece. She shifted on her feet. If there's something you need me to do, Mr. Sterling, I'd appreciate it if you told me instead of staring. He didn't flinch at the sharpness of her tone. If anything, the corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly. Still stubborn, I see. She stiffened. Still. 7 years hadn't erased the past, then. Dominic leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. You have debts. Savannah's stomach turned to ice. The words weren't a question. They were a statement, a confirmation of something he already knew. Her mouth went dry. I don't see how that's relevant to my job. He tilted his head, studying her like she was something fragile and reckless all at once. It's relevant to me. Savannah's pulse pounded in her ears. I don't want your pity, Dominic. Good, he said, voice calm, steady. Because that's not what I'm offering. She swallowed. Then what are you offering? A beat of silence. Then, in that smooth, controlled voice, he said. I'll pay off every cent you owe. The room shrank around her. Savannah gripped the edge of the desk, her vision blurring for a moment. The words shouldn't have affected her, but they did, because for the first time in years, she felt the possibility of air, of space, of relief. But nothing in this world was free. And Dominic Sterling was not a man who gave without expecting something in return. She lifted her chin, forcing steel into her spine. And what do you want in exchange? Dominic's gaze was unreadable. You work for me. Exclusively. Savannah's breath hitched. What does that even mean? She asked, her voice quieter now, laced with something she didn't want to name. Dominic stood slowly, rounding the desk until he was in front of her. Close enough that she caught the scent of him, clean, expensive, devastatingly familiar. It means no distractions. No side jobs. No waiting tables or running around trying to make ends meet. His voice dipped lower, as if the words weren't just about business. It means you belong to me, Savannah. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She forced herself to scoff. That's ridiculous. You think so? He leaned in, his tone almost mocking now. You think I don't know what it's like? The way debt sinks its claws into you? The way it keeps you up at night, keeps you from breathing? How much do you owe, Savannah? Her throat closed. 5 figures? He pressed. 6? She looked away. Dominic exhaled sharply. Who do you owe? Savannah closed her eyes for a brief second. Who don't I owe? The medical bills. The credit cards. The rent that had piled up after Landon had gotten sick last year, after she had taken time off work and everything had spiraled. And before that, before Landon was even born, there had been him. Landon's father. The man who had left her with nothing but a name on a birth certificate and a stack of unpaid loans in her name. She clenched her jaw. It's none of your business. Dominic's expression darkened. It is my business if it affects you. The certainty in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. Savannah turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. I don't need your help. You do, Dominic countered, stepping closer. You just don't want to take it. She spun to face him, anger sparking. Because it comes with strings. Because I know men like you, Dominic. Nothing is ever just a favor. You don't do things out of kindness. You collect. His gaze flickered with something unreadable. And you think I'd collect on you? Her breath caught. She didn't answer. Because she didn't know. She didn't know what Dominic Sterling wanted from her. She only knew that being in his orbit again felt too much like standing at the edge of a cliff. One wrong step, and she would fall. Dominic sighed, running a hand through his hair. Savannah, I'm not asking you to trust me. I know you won't. His voice softened, just a fraction. But you don't have to do this alone anymore. Something cracked inside her, just a little. Then her phone rang. She flinched at the sound, pulling it from her pocket, her stomach sinking when she saw the unknown number. Not unknown. Unwanted. She hesitated before answering, pressing the phone to her ear. Hello? A deep voice slithered through the line. Miss Hayes. The breath left her lungs. We haven't forgotten about you, the man continued, his tone dripping with amusement. And I'd hate to start looking for you at home. Savannah went ice cold. Landon. Her grip on the phone tightened. I told you, I just need more time. You've run out of time. The call ended. She didn't realize she was shaking until Dominic's hand closed over hers, prying the phone from her fingers. Who was that? His voice was dangerous now, low and edged with fury. Savannah's vision blurred. I have to go. You're not going anywhere until you tell me who that was. She tried to yank her hand free, but his grip held firm. Then, a sharp inhale. Dominic's gaze had fallen on her phone screen, on the lock screen. The picture. Landon. His dark curls, his bright eyes, his small hands clutching her sleeve. Savannah felt the moment the realization hit him. Dominic lifted his eyes to hers, and for the first time since she walked back into his life, she saw shock. He didn't speak. Didn't move. And then, in a voice that was quiet, but laced with something lethal, he asked. Whose child is that? Savannah's throat tightened. Mine. A beat of silence. Dominic's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did, something barely perceptible, like a shift in the air before a storm. His fingers curled around her phone, knuckles widening. And his father? She forced herself to stand tall. Gone. Something flickered in his eyes, something dark. Gone how? Savannah exhaled slowly. Not dead, if that's what you're asking. Just, gone. Dominic didn't speak for a long moment. When he finally did, his voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. And the debts? Are they his? Her stomach clenched. Some. Dominic's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking at the side. His grip on her phone loosened, and he placed it back in her palm, his fingers brushing against hers, warm, controlled, but full of unspoken tension. Then he met her gaze, and there was no amusement left in his eyes. "You should have told me, Savannah." She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the phone. "It wouldn't have changed anything." His lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't know that." A heavy silence settled between them. Then Dominic exhaled sharply, straightening. When he spoke again, his voice was laced with finality. "I'm paying your debts." Savannah opened her mouth to argue, but he cut her off. "This isn't a request. You owe the wrong people, and now they're threatening your son." His gaze burned into hers. "Which means this isn't just your problem anymore." Her heart pounded. "Dominic, you work for me now. Exclusively." His tone left no room for debate. "And I protect what belongs to me." Savannah's breath hitched. Because even though Landon wasn't his, even though their past was tangled with broken things, she could see it now. Dominic Sterling wasn't just offering a solution. He was pulling her into his world. And once Dominic decided to take charge of something, there was no escaping it. Savannah knew the exact moment her life stopped belonging to her. It wasn't when Dominic Sterling said he would pay her debts. It wasn't even when he forced her into working exclusively for him. It was now, right now, when she stepped outside her apartment building and found a black car idling at the curb. Not just any black car. His. Her stomach nodded as the tinted window rolled down, revealing Dominic sitting in the back seat, his expression unreadable. "Get in." Savannah stiffened. "Excuse me?" Dominic tilted his head slightly, his tone calm but firm. "Get in the car, Savannah." She exhaled sharply, gripping the strap of her bag tighter. "Why?" "I have work. I don't need." "You don't need what?" His voice was smooth, but there was something dangerous beneath it. "A ride?" "A reminder that there are men looking for you. Men who know where you live." Savannah's breath caught. Dominic sighed, rubbing his temple. "You really don't make this easy, do you?" "Funny," she muttered. "I don't remember asking you to do any of this." His gaze darkened. "You didn't have to." She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him to back off, to stop interfering. But the memory of last night's phone call, the voice on the other end, the quiet, amused threat, wrapped around her like cold steel. She slid into the car. The door shut with a quiet click, locking her in. Dominic didn't take her to the office. He took her to a high-rise building in the middle of the city, one with a private lobby and a doorman who greeted him by name. Savannah followed him into an elevator, pressing herself into the corner as Dominic slid a keycard through the panel. "You're moving." Her head snapped up. "What?" Dominic's gaze stayed on the elevator doors. "You and Landon. You're moving here. Today." Savannah let out a sharp laugh, crossing her arms. "You're out of your mind if you think." "I signed the lease this morning," Dominic continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Security is tight. Full-time concierge. No one gets in without clearance." He finally turned to face her, his jaw set. "It's not up for discussion." Savannah gaped at him, disbelief crashing over her. "Are you even listening to yourself? You don't get to do this, Dominic." He took a step closer, and suddenly the elevator felt too small, the air too thick. "You think I'm going to let you stay in that apartment?" His voice was quiet, controlled, but there was something simmering underneath. "With men like that looking for you?" Savannah's fingers curled into fists. "You're not my lover." Dominic's gaze dropped to her hands, then back up to her face. "No," he murmured. "But maybe I should be." The elevator doors slid open. Savannah stormed out. The apartment was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A skyline view. Space, so much space, that she could hardly comprehend it. But none of it mattered. Because this wasn't her home. "You can't just decide things for me," Savannah snapped, spinning to face Dominic. He leaned against the kitchen island, calm, composed, infuriatingly him. "You don't have a choice." Her hands trembled. "Yes, I do." Dominic exhaled slowly, then before she could react he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folder, placing it on the counter. "Take a look," he said. Savannah hesitated before stepping forward. And then she saw it. The photos. Her apartment building. The entrance. The hallway. Landon's daycare. The park they went to on weekends. A shadowy figure in the background of one of the images, watching. Savannah's stomach lurched. What the hell is this? Dominic's voice was lethal. Proof that you're not safe. She swallowed, her pulse pounding. You had me followed. You were already being followed, Dominic corrected, his voice sharp. I just made sure it was by me and not them. Savannah's fingers dug into the countertop, her vision blurring. This was real. This was happening. She wasn't just in debt. She wasn't just drowning. She was hunted. And Dominic, whether she liked it or not, was the only one standing between her and whatever was coming. Her shoulders slumped. Why? She whispered. Why are you doing this? Dominic didn't answer immediately. Then, in a voice that was softer than she expected, he said, because I can't watch something happen to you. Savannah's breath caught. And for the first time since she walked back into his life, she saw it. The fear beneath his fury. That night, Savannah sat on the edge of her bed in the new apartment, staring at the city lights outside the window. Landon was asleep in the next room. Safe. Unbothered. She, however, felt anything but. A soft knock sounded at the door. Savannah turned to find Dominic leaning against the frame, his tie loosened, his expression unreadable. You didn't eat, he said. She exhaled, rubbing her temples. Not hungry. Dominic walked in, standing in front of her. Too close. Close enough that she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers flexed at his sides like he was holding something back. I know you hate this, he said, his voice quieter now. Savannah swallowed. Hate isn't a strong enough word. A ghost of a smirk crossed his lips, but it didn't last. Instead, he reached out, slowly, deliberately, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She went still. His fingers lingered, just for a second. I'll protect you, Savannah, he murmured. Whether you let me or not. Something cracked inside her. Because for all the possession in his voice, for all the arrogance and control, there was something else, too, which she doesn't understand. His fingers lingered just a second too long, and Savannah hated the way her skin burned where he touched her. Hated the way her breath caught, the way something unfamiliar twisted deep inside her. This man, this impossible, infuriating man had taken over her life without permission. And yet, for the first time in years, the weight on her chest felt just a little lighter. She wasn't sure if that made him her savior or her biggest mistake. Maybe both. Savannah pulled away first, her voice barely above a whisper. Good night, Dominic. A slow exhale. A flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Then, just as quietly, good night, Savannah. The door clicked shut behind him. And Savannah sat there, staring at it, wondering if she had just made a deal with the devil. Or if the devil had been the one keeping her safe all along. Savannah had been prepared for many things when she introduced Landon to Dominic. Tears. Hesitation. Maybe even fear. What she hadn't been prepared for, what left her completely breathless, was how effortlessly Landon took to him. The moment Dominic crouched down and met Landon's curious gaze, it was as if some unspoken understanding passed between them. Hey, kid. Dominic's voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. Landon blinked, his small fingers clutching the hem of Savannah's shirt. You have a deep voice. Dominic let out a quiet chuckle. Yeah? Landon nodded. Like Batman. Savannah nearly choked. Dominic, however, seemed amused. I'll take that as a compliment. Landon studied him for a moment longer, then, to Savannah's utter shock, he grinned. Can you fly? Dominic smirked. Wrong superhero, buddy. Landon giggled, and before Savannah could even process it, her son, her careful, shy, slow-to-trust son reached for Dominic's hand. And Dominic took it. Without hesitation. Savannah stood frozen as Landon pulled Dominic toward his toy cars, excitedly chattering about which one was the fastest. Dominic followed without complaint, lowering himself onto the floor beside him. It was seamless. Natural. Like Dominic had always been there. And maybe that was what scared her the most. Or maybe it was something else. Because as she watched them, something tightened in her chest, a weight she'd carried for years, one that grew heavier with every passing second. They were too alike. Not in ways anyone would notice at first. But in the tilt of Landon's smile. In the way his brow furrowed in concentration, just like Dominic's did. In the way his small fingers gripped Dominic's shirt without hesitation, like his instincts recognized him. Savannah swallowed hard, pressing a hand to her stomach as nausea curled through her. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had spent years keeping her secret buried, convinced that she could carry it alone. But now, looking at them together, side by side. God, they were side by side. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold it in. Days passed, and Dominic made himself a presence in their lives in a way Savannah never expected. Every evening, after work, he arrived. Never empty-handed. Sometimes with groceries. Sometimes with paperwork. Once with a brand new set of racing cars that made Landon's entire face light up. Savannah tried to keep her distance, tried to remind herself that this was temporary. That Dominic was just fulfilling some misplaced sense of responsibility. But then there was the day he paid off her debts. Not with a wire transfer. Not with a quiet call to his bank. No, Dominic Sterling made a statement. She found out when he called her to his office, and she walked in to see every single person she owed money to seated in his conference room, looking pale, nervous, and far too small in the presence of the man who had summoned them. Savannah's stomach dropped. Dominic, what the heck is this? He stood at the head of the table, composed, powerful. This is your freedom. One by one, they signed documents, forced to acknowledge that they held no claim over her anymore. And when the last signature was done, Dominic leaned forward, his voice deathly calm. If any of you so much as breathe in Savannah's direction again, you'll regret it. No one argued. And just like that, years of fear and suffocating weight vanished. Savannah didn't know whether to thank him or strangle him. Maybe both. The final blow to her emotional walls came when Landon's acceptance letter arrived. Savannah held the thick envelope in shaking hands, unable to believe what she was seeing. A prestigious school. A future she could never have given him on her own. She turned to Dominic, voice barely above a whisper. You did this. He didn't deny it. Savannah exhaled shakily. Why? Dominic's gaze flickered to Landon, who was busy building a tower of blocks in the corner. Then he looked back at her. Because he deserves the best. His voice was quiet, but firm. And so do you. Something lodged itself in Savannah's throat. She had no words. Just an overwhelming, terrifying, all-consuming ache. Dominic never stayed the night. Every evening, he was there, dinner with Landon, stories, sometimes even playing games on the floor like he belonged. But when the night deepened, he left, returning to his penthouse a few blocks away. Savannah should have been relieved. Instead, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the space where he should be. It was dangerous. This, dependence. This quiet longing she refused to name. But it was getting harder and harder to fight. And then, one night, she stopped fighting. It was raining. Hard. The kind of storm that rattled the windows and filled the air with electricity. Landon had long since fallen asleep, curled up under his favorite blanket. Savannah stood by the window, watching the rain blur the city lights, lost in thought. She didn't hear Dominic approach until he was right beside her. You should get some rest. His voice was softer than usual. Savannah exhaled. I don't think I can. A pause. Then, what's keeping you up? She didn't know how to answer that. Didn't know how to admit that it was him. Instead, she turned her head, studying him in the dim light. Why do you keep coming back? Dominic held her gaze, his expression unreadable. Do you want me to stop? Her heart pounded. She should say yes. Instead, she whispered, I don't know. Something shifted in the air between them. Dominic reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His fingers brushed against hers, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver up her spine. You drive me insane, you know that? His voice was rough now, like he was barely holding something back. Savannah swallowed. You're not exactly easy to handle yourself. A low chuckle. Then before she could process it, Dominic lifted his hand, tracing the curve of her jaw with his thumb. Savannah's breath hitched. It was reckless. Stupid. But when Dominic leaned in, slow, deliberate, she didn't move away. And when his lips finally met hers, she melted. It wasn't careful. It was raw, messy, like crossing a line they both knew could never be undone. Dominic kissed her like a man who had run out of patience. Like a man who had spent too long pretending he didn't want to. And Savannah? She let him. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't holding herself together. She was unraveling. And Dominic Sterling was the only man who made her believe she wouldn't break until he returned back into their lives. The person who Savannah hated the most. Her child's father. Savannah never thought she'd see his face again. Yet here he was. Standing on her doorstep, dripping from the rain, the man she had once called her husband. "Hello, Savannah." Her breath hitched. For years, she had trained herself to forget the sound of his voice. To erase the way it used to make her stomach knot, not from love, but from dread. She glanced behind her instinctively, where Landon sat in the living room, unaware. Happy. Safe. But not if this man had anything to do with it. Savannah stepped outside, shutting the door behind her, her pulse hammering. "What do you want, Michael?" His smirk was as sharp as she remembered. "That's a hell of a way to greet your ex-husband. You're not supposed to be here." Michael clicked his tongue. "And yet, here I am." His gaze flickered to the door. "Where's my son?" Something icy slid down Savannah's spine. "He's not your son." Michael's jaw twitched, but his smile remained, cruel and knowing. "Ah, but see, legally, that's not true, is it?" Savannah's nails dug into her palms. She had fought like hell in the divorce to sever his rights. But Michael had money, connections, and a ruthless ability to manipulate the system. In the end, the court had granted him visitation rights. Rights he had never used. Not once in 4 years. So why now? "What do you want?" She demanded again, voice tight. Michael's smirk widened. "To see my son, of course. It's my right." Liar. Michael had never cared about Landon. He had barely acknowledged him during their marriage. The only thing he had ever wanted was control. "I'm calling the police," Savannah said, reaching for her phone. Michael's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "Careful, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice just low enough to make her stomach churn. "You don't want to make this ugly." Savannah yanked her hand free, fury and fear twisting inside her. And then, a shadow moved behind Michael. A deep, deadly voice cut through the rain. "I'd let go of her if I were you." Michael stiffened. Savannah turned, her breath catching as she met Dominic's storm-filled gaze. He was standing a few feet away, his suit soaked from the rain, his presence crackling with something lethal. Michael's smirk faltered. "And who the hell are you?" Dominic stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "The man who will bury you if you touch her again." Michael laughed, but there was unease in his eyes. "Ah? That's why you're here. I always wondered what happened to Dominic Sterling." His gaze flickered between them. 7 years ago, you two were inseparable. And then, suddenly, you were gone, Savannah. No warning, no goodbye. "Tell me, did you ever tell him why you left?" Dominic went still beside her. Savannah felt his eyes on her. She couldn't look at him. Not now. Not when the past was bleeding into the present in the worst possible way. Michael tilted his head. "You never told him, did you?" His grin turned razor-sharp. "I think he deserves to know, don't you?" Dominic's voice was eerily calm. "I don't give a damn about your games. You're not seeing Landon." Michael's amusement darkened. "I wouldn't be so sure about that." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. Savannah's stomach twisted. It was a court summons. Michael's voice dripped with satisfaction. "See you in court, sweetheart." Then he turned and disappeared into the rain. Inside, Dominic didn't speak. Not as he shut the door. Not as he ran a hand through his rain-damp hair. Savannah wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the tremors in her body. "You left me." His voice was quiet. But there was no mistaking the raw edge beneath it. Savannah squeezed her eyes shut. "Dominic." "Why?" She forced herself to look at him. To finally face what she had buried for so long. "I didn't have a choice." Dominic's jaw tightened. "No." Savannah swallowed, her chest tightening. 7 years ago. She and Dominic had been in love. The kind of love that is burned, reckless and all-consuming. They had plans, dreams. He had wanted to take her away, build a life together. But then, her father's debt had come due. A debt she hadn't even known existed until it was too late. Michael had been the one holding the chains. He had come to her with an offer. Marry him, and the debt would disappear. Refuse, and her father would lose everything, including his life. Savannah had been 22. Young. Desperate. And Dominic. She had loved him too much to let him get dragged into the nightmare. So she had left. Without a word. She had married Michael, spent years in a cold, loveless marriage until she had finally found the strength to run. But the worst part? She found out she was pregnant a day after marrying Michael. Savannah had stood in that cold bathroom, staring at the 2 pink lines on the test, her hands trembling. Dominic's baby. His son. And yet, she had been trapped. Michael had given Landon his name, another form of control. Another way to ensure she never had full freedom. Dominic paced the living room like a caged predator, hands clenched into fists. His jaw was tight, his stormy eyes locked onto her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. Savannah stood frozen, watching the fury build inside him, knowing it was only a matter of time before it exploded. "I can't believe this," he muttered, dragging a hand through his dark hair. "You married him." "Him? Of all people, Savannah." She flinched. "You think I had a choice?" "You always had a choice." His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "You could have come to me. You could have trusted me." Savannah's heart clenched. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand," he demanded. Her breath hitched. Because how could she? How could she explain the nights she spent curled up, suffocating under Michael's control? The cold, empty marriage where she was nothing more than a possession? How could she tell Dominic that the only reason she had agreed to that marriage was to save her father from ruin? "I didn't leave because I wanted to," she whispered, voice trembling. "Michael had my father cornered. He was going to lose everything, his home, his business. He would have been destroyed. Marrying Michael was the only way to stop it." Dominic let out a sharp breath, turning away for a moment. When he faced her again, his expression was unreadable. "That was 7 years ago," he said, voice quieter now, but no less intense. "What about after? You left him. You could have come back to me." Savannah swallowed hard. "It wasn't that simple." His eyes darkened. "Then tell me why. What else were you keeping from me?" She took a step back. "Dominic." He moved closer, his presence overwhelming. "Tell me the truth, Savannah." Her pulse pounded. "I am telling you the truth." No, his voice was low, but deadly. "You're still hiding something." She sucked in a sharp breath. She had never seen Dominic like this before. Not just angry but desperate. Desperate to understand. Desperate to piece together the years that had been stolen from them. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling roughly. "Damn it, Savannah. Why do I feel like there's something else?" She opened her mouth. Closed it. Dominic shook his head. "You've been lying to me since the day we met again." Looking me in the eye and pretending, he suddenly stilled. His sharp gaze locked onto hers. "You never told me how old Landon is." Savannah's stomach dropped. Dominic's entire body went rigid, his mind working at a terrifying speed. "He's what, 6?" His voice was eerily calm, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Something dangerous. Savannah couldn't breathe. 6. She could see the exact moment Dominic did the math. His expression shifted, shattered. His next words came out hoarse. "Tell me he's not mine." Savannah's lips parted, but no sound came out. "Savannah." His voice was pure gravel. "Tell me. Right now." Her throat tightened. Lying wouldn't work anymore. Her vision blurred as she whispered, "He's yours." A thick, suffocating silence filled the room. Dominic staggered back, like she had physically struck him. His breathing was ragged, his hands clenched so tight they shook. "Mine." The word came out rough, almost like he didn't believe it. Savannah's chest ached. "I found out I was pregnant the day after I married Michael." The confession spilled from her lips before she could stop it. Dominic's head snapped up, his face twisting into something unreadable. "The day after?" She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I wanted to tell you. I swear, I did. But I was already trapped. Michael had full legal control over everything. I didn't even know if I could protect Landon from him." Dominic's entire body trembled. "So you let him give my son his name?" Savannah's voice cracked. "I didn't have a choice." Dominic let out a harsh breath, shoving a hand through his hair. 7 years, Savannah, he whispered, voice thick with emotion. You let me believe you just left. You let me believe Landon was someone else's. Savannah wrapped her arms around herself, shaking. I thought I was protecting him. I thought I was protecting you. Dominic let out a bitter, breathless laugh. Protecting me? You took everything from me. Savannah's heart clenched. She had stolen years from him. First words. First steps. First laughs. Dominic turned away, dragging a rough hand over his face. I missed everything. Savannah stepped closer. I'm sorry. Dominic didn't move. Didn't look at her. Dominic didn't forgive her instantly. In the days following the truth, there was a coldness to him. Not cruel, not hateful, just distant. He still came over every evening, still spent time with Landon, but when his eyes met Savannah's, she saw the weight of what she had taken from him. She had stolen 7 years of his son's life. And yet, Dominic never raised his voice again. Never lashed out. He was trying. So was she. She would catch him staring at Landon when he thought no one was looking. Studying every movement, every laugh, like he was memorizing a son he should have known from the moment he was born. And when Savannah would sit beside him at night, and the silence between them became too heavy, she finally told him the things she had never spoken aloud. I never stopped loving you, she whispered one night. Dominic's breath hitched. She hesitated, staring down at her hands. I've been guilty every day for 7 years. Not just for keeping Landon from you, but for leaving you at all. Her voice cracked. I wanted to go back to you so many times, but I thought I'd lost you forever. Dominic's voice was raw. You did. Her throat tightened. Then, slowly, Dominic reached out. His fingers brushed against hers, hesitant at first. Testing. I hated you for it, he admitted. For leaving. For taking my son away. Savannah felt tears prick at her eyes. Dominic's grip tightened. But not once did I stop loving you. The breath left her lungs. When she looked up at him, she found a truth so deep in his gaze it shattered every remaining wall inside her. She had spent so long pretending she could live without Dominic Sterling. But she had never stopped belonging to him. So when he kissed her, she didn't resist. And when he whispered, I love you, she let herself believe it. Landon was the light between them. They spent their mornings together, Dominic taking him to school while Savannah worked. Their evenings became filled with laughter, movie nights, bedtime stories, simple joys Savannah had never imagined she would share with Dominic again. And on weekends, they went out. It had been Landon's wish, his small, innocent dream. I always wanted to go on a picnic with a family, he had admitted one night, his little voice sleepy. Like, a real family. Savannah's heart clenched. Dominic met her gaze from across the room, something unspoken passing between them. The next morning, they packed a basket and took Landon to the park. It was nothing extravagant, just a blanket under a tree, sandwiches, fresh air, and laughter. But to Landon, it was everything. He ran across the grass, Dominic chasing him in a game of tag, both of them breathless with laughter. Savannah watched, something breaking inside her. Landon had never bonded so easily with anyone. But with Dominic, it was effortless. Savannah wrapped her arms around herself, both warmth and sadness filling her chest. She hadn't told Landon the truth. Neither had Dominic. They had talked about it late at night, tangled in sheets and whispered confessions. Should we tell him? She had asked softly, her head resting against Dominic's chest. Dominic hesitated. I want to. But he's still a child. It's already a big change for him. Savannah bit her lip. What if he doesn't take it well? Dominic exhaled, fingers stroking through her hair. Then we wait. Just a little longer. Until I make sure he trusts me. Really trusts me. So they had waited. But then, Landon changed everything. The sun had begun to set, bathing the park in warm orange light. Landon plopped down beside them on the blanket, biting into a cookie Dominic had bought him. His small legs swung back and forth as he watched the families around them, mothers and fathers, laughing with their kids, holding them close. Then, without hesitation, he turned to Dominic and asked the one question that made Savannah's breath stop. Can you be my dad? Silence. The world seemed to still around them. Savannah's heart stopped beating. Dominic stiffened, his entire body frozen. Landon, unaware of the bomb he had just dropped, continued happily. I mean, you're always here, he said matter-of-factly. And you take care of us. And Mom likes you. And I like you. So can you be my dad? Savannah's breath came out in a shaky exhale. Landon wasn't asking because he knew the truth. He was asking because he wanted it to be true. She turned to Dominic, dread pooling in her stomach. He looked shaken. Something raw flashed in his eyes before he let out a small breathless laugh. Is that what you want, buddy? He asked, his voice strangely hoarse. Landon nodded eagerly. Savannah's throat tightened. Dominic smiled, soft, tender. He ruffled Landon's hair. Then I'll do my best. Landon beamed. Savannah? She wanted to cry. But the moment was shattered when her phone rang. She barely had time to react before Dominic snatched the phone out of her hands, checking the caller ID. His jaw locked. Savannah's stomach sank. It was Michael. Dominic answered, his voice dropping into something dark. What the heck do you want? Michael's chuckle on the other end sent chills down Savannah's spine. You should ask your little girlfriend, Michael said smoothly. She might want to lawyer up. Savannah's blood ran cold. Dominic's grip tightened around the phone. You have nothing, Michael. Oh, but I do, Michael mused. See, Savannah might have taken Landon when she left me, but legally? I still have parental rights. Savannah's breath stopped. No. Michael chuckled again. I'm filing for custody. Savannah's vision blurred. No. No, no, no. Dominic's entire body turned rigid. Like heck you are. Michael's voice dropped to a taunting whisper. See you in court, Sterling. The call ended. Savannah felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Dominic slowly lowered the phone, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to her, eyes dark, voice deadly. He'll never take him from us, Dominic vowed. Savannah swallowed the lump in her throat, her pulse pounding. Because Michael wasn't bluffing. And now, they had a war to fight. Savannah had known fear before. She had known it when she was forced to marry Michael. When she found out she was pregnant with Dominic's child the day after. When she spent years looking over her shoulder, terrified of the man she had once called her husband. But nothing compared to this. To sitting in a cold, sterile office, her hand gripping Dominic's as they waited for the DNA results. Dominic had insisted on it. Not because he doubted Landon was his son, but because they needed legal proof. Michael had blindsided them, using his name on Landon's birth certificate as leverage. If the court sees that Landon is mine by blood, his case will crumble, Dominic had said firmly. This will end. Savannah had believed that. She had clung to it. But as she sat there now, waiting for the doctor to return, her stomach twisted into impossible knots. Dominic's grip tightened around hers. Breathe. She looked up at him. His expression was unreadable, calm, in control. But she saw it in his eyes. The flicker of something dark. He was scared, too. The door finally opened. Dr. Harris, the geneticist, stepped in, holding an envelope. His face was unreadable. Savannah's heart pounded as Dominic sat up straighter beside her. Dr. Harris cleared his throat. We received the DNA comparison results between Landon Sterling and Dominic Sterling. Savannah swallowed hard. Dominic exhaled. Go on. The doctor hesitated. Then he looked Dominic in the eye. I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling. The test results show that Landon is not biologically related to you. The world stopped. Savannah's entire body turned cold. For a second, there was nothing, no breath, no sound, no movement. Then Dominic let go of her hand. She felt it like a knife to the chest. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. What? Dominic's voice was quiet. Too quiet. The doctor sighed, setting the paper down. We checked twice. The results are conclusive. Savannah's heartbeat roared in her ears. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Something was wrong. Her fingers shook as she grabbed the report, scanning it with blurry vision. Landon's name. Dominic's name. The conclusion. Not a match. Her stomach turned. This had to be a mistake. She turned to Dominic, panic clawing at her throat. I swear to you, But he wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the paper. staring at the words that ripped his world apart. Then, slowly, he stood. Savannah grabbed his wrist. Dominic. His arm tensed under her touch. Then he pulled away. The rejection burned through her like acid. He turned to Dr. Harris. I want this redone. His voice was sharp, controlled. Cold. I don't care if you check twice. Do it again. Dr. Harris hesitated. Mr. Sterling. Do it again. The authority in his tone left no room for argument. The doctor nodded stiffly. I'll order another test immediately. Dominic nodded once. Then, without a single glance at Savannah, he walked out. Savannah found him in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. She opened the door, slipping into the passenger seat. He didn't look at her. She reached for him. Dominic, please. Don't. The single word sliced through her. His jaw was clenched, his breathing controlled but uneven. I don't understand, she whispered. This is wrong. You know this is wrong. He finally turned to her. His eyes were dark, unreadable. Do I? Her breath hitched. You think I lied to you? Dominic didn't answer. And that silence was worse than any accusation. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. I never once got together with Michael. You know that. His voice was eerily calm. Do I? Savannah flinched. Dominic exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. He looked exhausted. Torn. But still, he didn't reach for her. You kept Landon from me for 7 years, he said quietly. What else have you kept from me? Her chest caved. This was Michael's doing. She knew it. Somehow, Michael had tampered with the results. He had power, connections. He had planned this from the start. But Dominic believed it. Even if it was just a sliver of doubt, even if he wanted to believe her, it was there. She couldn't breathe. She had risked everything, let herself fall for him again, let herself trust. And now, just like before, she was alone. Her fingers curled into fists. She wiped at her eyes and forced herself to straighten. Fine, she whispered. If you think so little of me, then I won't waste my time proving myself. Dominic's expression darkened. Savannah. She opened the door and stepped out. Dominic didn't stop her. He let her go. Savannah should have left. She should have taken Landon, packed their bags, and disappeared before Michael could sink his claws deeper into their lives. But instead, she found herself standing in front of him. Michael leaned back against the sleek leather chair in his hotel suite, a smug grin curling at the edges of his lips. I was wondering when you'd come. Savannah's hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists, refusing to show weakness. What did you do? Michael raised a brow. You'll have to be more specific, sweetheart. She slammed the DNA results onto the table between them. This? You tampered with it. His grin widened. And if I did? Rage burned in her veins. Landon is Dominic's son. You know it. Michael let out a mock sigh, shaking his head. Oh, Savannah. Always so naive. He leaned forward, eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. The courts don't care about what's true. They care about proof. And right now? He tapped the paper. This says Landon is mine. Her stomach twisted. Why? Why go this far? Michael's expression darkened, his smirk vanishing. Because you humiliated me. You ran the first chance you got. And now, after all these years, you think you can play happy family with him? He scoffed. I don't think so. Savannah forced herself to stay calm. Landon isn't a game piece, Michael. He's a child. A child I legally claimed the day I married you. Her pulse pounded. You never wanted him. You barely acknowledged him when we were married. Michael's lips curled in a sneer. That was before I realized how useful he could be. Cold fear slithered down her spine. What are you talking about? Michael stood slowly, stepping around the table, invading her space. She fought the urge to flinch as he brushed a finger along the edge of her hair. You still don't get it, do you? His voice dropped, deceptively soft. Dominic Sterling built his empire on control. Power. He thinks he can buy his way through anything. His fingers trailed to her chin, forcing her to look up at him. But there's one thing even Dominic Sterling can't buy, Michael whispered, his breath hot against her skin. She swallowed hard. What? Michael smiled. A child that the law says isn't his. Savannah's blood turned to ice. Michael leaned in, his voice a chilling promise. And I'm going to make sure he watches while I take Landon away. Savannah sat in the courtroom's waiting area, her hands clenched in her lap. The world outside was moving as usual, cars honking, people walking, life continuing. But for her, everything had come to a suffocating halt. Landon wasn't here. He had been left with a court-appointed guardian for the time being, shielded from the battle unfolding between the people fighting to claim him. Savannah had thought she would have Dominic beside her. But she didn't. Michael was. And he was enjoying every second of it. He sat across from her, legs crossed, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. You look nervous, sweetheart. Savannah refused to engage. She stared at the marble floor, willing herself to stay strong. Michael sighed, leaning forward. You know, I almost feel bad for you. Her head snapped up. He smiled. I mean, Dominic should be here by now, don't you think? But he isn't. Strange, isn't it? Savannah's fingers dug into her palms. He'll come. Will he? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like he's already abandoned you. Again. Savannah's breath hitched. Michael chuckled, shaking his head in mock pity. You really thought he'd show up? After everything? After you lied to him? After you kept his son from him? He sighed. Maybe I should be thanking you. If you hadn't pushed him away so thoroughly, I wouldn't have had such an easy time doing this. Michael saw the hesitation flicker in her eyes and pounced. Maybe you really thought he loved you. He chuckled, shaking his head. That's adorable, really. But Savannah, Dominic Sterling doesn't love anyone. He collects things. People. And when they stop being useful, he throws them away. Savannah swallowed against the lump forming in her throat. Michael leaned in, his voice like poison. You were just another mistake for him. And Landon? Dominic never wanted a child. You think a man like that will sacrifice his perfect, controlled life for a kid? He laughed. No, sweetheart. You were always alone. Savannah's vision blurred. She wanted to scream at him. To tell him he was wrong. That Dominic would never abandon them. But Dominic still wasn't here. And the courtroom doors were about to open. Michael's smirk widened as he stood. Now, be a good mother and don't fight this. Landon deserves better than the life you can give him. With that, he strolled into the courtroom, confident. Smug. Savannah forced herself to stand, though her legs felt like they might give out beneath her. She had to fight. Even if it meant losing. Because she wouldn't give up on her son. Never. The courtroom was silent. Michael sat beside his lawyers, exuding arrogance. Savannah was alone, gripping the edge of the table in front of her. The judge adjusted his glasses, looking down at the documents before him. After reviewing the evidence presented, including financial stability and the well-being of the child, it is in this court's opinion that custody of Landon will go to Michael. Just before the judge finished his sentence, the court doors slammed open. A collective gasp rippled through the room as Dominic Sterling strode in. He was dressed in a sharp, charcoal gray suit, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding. But it wasn't just him. Behind him, a small army of lawyers followed, their steps synchronized, their faces cold and calculating. Michael stiffened. Savannah's breath caught. Dominic didn't look at anyone but her as he crossed the room, his eyes locking onto hers. And in them, she saw everything she needed to know. He wasn't going to let her lose. He wasn't going to let them lose. He stopped at her side, resting a hand on the small of her back, a silent reassurance. Then, he turned his piercing gaze toward the judge. I apologize for the delay, Your Honor, Dominic said smoothly. But I needed to ensure the truth was presented today. Michael scoffed. What truth? The DNA test proves Landon is my son. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Dominic's face. Which DNA test? Michael blinked. The one. Dominic snapped his fingers. One of his lawyers stepped forward, handing a thick file to the judge. The judge flipped through the pages, his brows furrowing. Mr. Sterling, what is the meaning of this? Dominic's voice was razor-sharp. Your Honor, my team secured multiple independent DNA tests. And as you'll see, every single one of them proves that I am Landon's biological father. Michael shot to his feet. That's impossible. Dominic cut him off. The only impossible thing is how you managed to alter official results. Luckily, I have ample evidence to present to the court. Another file was handed to the judge. The silence was suffocating. The judge read through the pages, then looked at Michael with something close to disgust. Mr. Harrington, do you have an explanation for this? Michael's face twisted. This is ridiculous. He's lying. Enough. The judge's voice was firm. He turned to Savannah. Ms. Hayes, are you aware of this? Savannah hesitated. She looked at Dominic, at the unwavering trust in his eyes. He had done this. For her. For Landon. She let out a shaky breath. I had no idea. Michael slammed his fists on the table. This is a setup. Dominic didn't even glance at him. His entire focus was on Savannah. He reached for her hand beneath the table, squeezing it gently. I told you, he murmured. I'd never let him take Landon from us. Savannah's throat tightened. The judge sighed. Given the new evidence, I see no reason to entertain Mr. Harrington's custody claim. Effective immediately, full parental rights belong to Dominic Sterling and Savannah Hayes. Michael paled. You can't. The judge cut him off with a sharp glare. And given the forged DNA documents, this court will be issuing an investigation into your actions. Michael's entire body went rigid. Two officers stepped forward. Panic flashed across his face. Wait. One of them grabbed his arm. Michael Harrington, you're under arrest for tampering with legal documents. No, wait. You can't do this. But it was too late. The last thing Savannah saw was Michael being dragged away, shouting curses. Then the doors shut. Savannah barely had time to process everything before Dominic turned her toward him. Her bottom lip trembled. You really came. Dominic exhaled, brushing a tear from her cheek. Did you really think I wouldn't? I didn't know what to think, she admitted. After everything, after what Michael said. A shadow passed over Dominic's face. What did he say to you? She shook her head. It doesn't matter. Dominic's jaw clenched. It does. Savannah swallowed hard. He said that you wouldn't come. That you never really loved me. That you only collect people. Dominic's grip on her tightened. Savannah, look at me. She did. His voice was raw, stripped of all barriers. You are not a mistake. You are not something I collected. He let out a shaky breath. I love you. I have always loved you. And if you think for 1 second I wouldn't burn the world down for you and Landon, then you don't know me at all. Her walls cracked. And for the first time, she let them. A sob broke free as she threw herself into his arms. Dominic caught her without hesitation, holding her tightly as she trembled against him. I trust you, she whispered against his chest. I'm so sorry I ever doubted you. Dominic pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I'm never leaving you again. Savannah exhaled shakily, pressing her forehead against Dominic's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. His arms wrapped around her, strong and unyielding, as if anchoring her to something she had spent years running from, home. Not a place. Not just a feeling. Him. She had spent so long convincing herself she could survive alone. That she had to. But standing here, with Dominic holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world, she realized something. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was finally home. Savannah walked into the room as Landon's laughter echoed through the living room as Dominic playfully wrestled him onto the couch. Their son's giggles were uninhibited, pure, something that had once been a rarity in Savannah's life. But not anymore. Savannah turned, leaning against the balcony door frame. Dominic had Landon in a mock headlock, his expression exaggerated as he let their son win and push him back onto the cushions. Landon grinned triumphantly. Told you I'm strong, Mr. Dominic. Dominic chuckled, sitting up. I never doubted it, champ. Savannah's chest tightened. Mr. Dominic. Landon still didn't know. Dominic met her gaze from across the room, his expression softening. He knew what she was thinking. They had talked about this, about how and when to tell Landon the truth. Savannah took a breath, steadying herself. It was time. She walked over, sitting beside Landon. He immediately curled into her, his small arms wrapping around her waist. "Hey, sweetheart," she murmured, brushing his curls back. Landon looked up at her with wide eyes. "Yeah?" Savannah swallowed past the lump in her throat. "There's something really important I need to tell you." Landon blinked, his tiny brows furrowing. "Is it bad?" "No," she whispered. "Not bad at all." Dominic sat up straighter, his gaze unwavering. He didn't push. He didn't rush her. He simply let her do this at her own pace. Savannah exhaled. "Remember how I told you before that families don't always look the same? That sometimes, people who love each other don't get to be together right away." Landon nodded slowly. She hesitated for a second, then took his small hands in hers. "Sweetheart, Mr. Dominic isn't just Mommy's friend. He's someone very, very special to both of us." Landon's little face scrunched in confusion. "Like, extra special?" Savannah took a breath, her fingers curling into Dominic's. "Do you remember how you said you wanted Dominic to be your dad?" Landon nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah. But he's not, right?" She swallowed, her voice thick with emotion. "He is." Landon blinked. "What?" Savannah's hand trembled slightly as she cupped his cheek. "Dominic is your real father, baby. He always has been." For a moment, Landon just stared. Then, slowly, his face broke into the biggest, brightest grin. "Really?" His voice was filled with pure wonder. Dominic's throat worked as he nodded. "Yeah, buddy. I'm your dad." Landon didn't hesitate. He launched himself into Dominic's arms, hugging him so tightly that Dominic let out a small chuckle, wrapping his arms around his son. "I knew it." Landon cried. "I knew it. That's why we're so alike, right? And why do I like being with you so much?" Dominic swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, that's exactly why." Landon beamed. "So, can we have a big dinner together? Like a real family dinner?" Dominic chuckled, pressing a kiss to Landon's forehead. "Anything you want." Landon pulled back slightly, his eyes shining. "Does this mean I can call you Dad now?" Dominic exhaled sharply, his grip on Landon tightening. "You can call me whatever you want, kid." "Dad," Landon whispered, testing the word. Then, louder, "Dad." Dominic's eyes closed for a moment, as if he was letting the word settle deep inside him. Then he opened them and smiled. "Yeah? I love you, Dad." Savannah felt her heart shatter and heal all at once. Dominic cupped the back of Landon's head, pressing a kiss there. "I love you too, my son." Savannah wiped her tears, watching the two most important people in her life finally find each other. And in that moment, she knew, they were finally whole. 3 weeks later, Landon was sprawled on the couch, humming happily as he colored. Savannah stood at the kitchen counter, flipping through some papers, trying to focus. But her mind kept drifting to Dominic, to Landon, to the way her life had changed in such a short time. She didn't notice Dominic step up behind her until she felt his arms wrap around her waist. She startled slightly, but Dominic just pressed a soft kiss to her shoulder. "Relax," he murmured against her skin. She sighed, leaning into him. Dominic hummed, resting his chin atop her head. "Landon's happy. We're together. And I have something to make you smile." Savannah turned slightly, narrowing her eyes. "Oh?" Dominic reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Savannah froze. Dominic stepped back slightly, turning her in his arms. Then, in one smooth motion, he dropped to one knee. Savannah's heart stopped. Landon gasped from the couch. "Oh, is this the thing where you ask Mommy to marry you?" Dominic chuckled. "Yeah, buddy. It is." Savannah stared at him, utterly breathless. Dominic's voice was steady, but there was something raw in his gaze. "Savannah Hayes, I have loved you since the moment I first saw you. I loved you 7 years ago, and I love you now. More than anything." His voice wavered slightly. "You gave me a son. You gave me a reason to fight. And I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you and Landon never doubt how much I love you." Tears slipped down Savannah's cheeks as Dominic continued, "I lost you once, Savannah. I'm never letting that happen again." He exhaled, holding the ring up. "Marry me. Be my wife. Let's give Landon the family he deserves." the one we deserve. She glanced at Landon, who was practically bouncing in place. Mommy, say yes. A watery laugh escaped her lips. She turned back to Dominic, her heart hammering. There had been so much pain. So many years of regret. But now, standing here, looking at the man she had loved for so long, the father of her child, the man who had fought for her, for their son. She knew there was only one answer. Savannah dropped to her knees, cupping Dominic's face. Yes, she whispered, barely holding back a sob. 1,000 times, yes. Dominic let out a shaky breath before capturing her lips in a deep, searing kiss. Landon let out a delighted squeal. We're getting married. Savannah laughed against Dominic's lips, her fingers tangling in his hair. And as Dominic pulled her close, his arms solid and unwavering around her, Savannah felt it, not just love, but something deeper. A promise. A place she had once lost but had finally found again. Not a dream. Not a fleeting moment. This was real. This was home. And it always would be. The end.